The small town of Eldridge, tucked away in the southern United States, was known for its peaceful streets and quiet residents. It had always been a place where people could trust their neighbors and never expected anything out of the ordinary to happen. However, that sense of safety would soon be shattered when a dark secret began to unfold. It started with an anonymous tip to the local police. The message, scribbled hastily on a scrap of paper, hinted at something disturbing happening at the taco restaurant on Main Street. The tipster claimed that the chef, a man named Jerome Jax Thompson, was serving tacos made from human flesh. At first, the police dismissed it as a prank. After all, who would believe such a wild accusation? But the tip would not be ignored for long. The truth began to unravel in the most horrifying way. A body had been found in the nearby woods, and forensic analysis quickly revealed that it had been brutally dismembered. That body would later be linked to the wife of Jax Thompson, a woman named Evelyn Thompson. She had disappeared just days before the discovery of the body. Jax had always been known as a friendly, albeit strange man. He ran the taco restaurant alone, often working long hours late into the night. His customers raved about his tacos, praising the unique flavors that kept them coming back for more. But behind the kitchen doors, something darker was simmering. Evelyn, his wife, had known something was wrong for months. She had begun to notice strange changes in Jax's behavior, his growing secrecy, and his obsession with his restaurant. At first, she had tried to ignore it, convincing herself that she was overreacting. But deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was happening. Her fears reached a boiling point when she discovered a hidden room in their house. Inside, there were jars filled with strange, preserved items, some of which she couldn't identify. She also found stacks of strange paperwork, including photographs of people she didn't recognize. Evelyn's heart sank when she realized that these were not just random items. They were evidence of something much worse. The realization hit her like a wave. Jax had been involved in something sinister. She knew she had to confront him, but she also knew that doing so could cost her life. In the days that followed, Evelyn grew more determined to expose her husband's secret. She started gathering evidence, hoping to take it to the police. She had no idea that her discovery would lead to her brutal end. Jax, knowing that his dark secret was about to be exposed, made a horrifying decision. His wife had become a threat to him, and in his twisted mind, she had to be silenced, permanently. Jax Thompson had always been a man of meticulous habits. Every detail of his life, from the way he ran his restaurant to the way he arranged his home, was done with precision. Over the years, he had perfected the art of being unremarkable, just another friendly chef in a small town. But beneath the surface, a much darker part of him had been quietly growing, nourished by years of hiding his true nature. As Evelyn's suspicions began to bloom into undeniable knowledge, Jax felt the tight grip of fear tightening around him. He had always prided himself on his ability to stay one step ahead of anyone who might get too close to discovering his secret. But Evelyn was different. She wasn't easily fooled, and her recent behavior had revealed just how close she was to uncovering the horrific truth about what was being served at their restaurant. For weeks, Evelyn had grown more distant and more determined to find answers. Her once trusting nature had shifted into something darker, something that Jax could no longer control. She had started asking questions, poking around the house, and even following him at times when he thought she wouldn't notice. Her suspicions had finally pushed her to search the house thoroughly, and what she found only confirmed her worst fears. The hidden room in their basement was filled with jars and bags of preserved items, pieces of bodies that didn't belong to any animal Jax had ever mentioned. Evelyn had pieced the puzzle together in her mind. The strange smell, the mysterious cuts of meat in the kitchen, the oddities that had once seemed like mere quirks in Jax's behavior. She knew he had been serving human flesh. It was on the night of her discovery that Jax finally made his decision. He couldn't allow her to go any further. Her prying had crossed a line, and he knew that if she ever spoke of what she had found, everything would come crashing down. So, he waited, biding his time as Evelyn unknowingly walked into the trap he had set for her. The evening began like any other. Jax had prepared a special dinner for the two of them. The kitchen smelled rich with the scent of slow-cooked meat, an aroma that had always made Evelyn feel at ease in their home. But tonight the scent seemed wrong. It wasn't the comforting smell of the dishes she had grown accustomed to over the years. There was something off about it, something that made her skin crawl. Her senses were heightened as she stepped through the door, the faintest tremor of unease growing inside her. As Jax busied himself at the stove, his movements slow and deliberate, Evelyn lingered in the doorway watching him. She felt a pit forming in her stomach. Everything about this evening felt strange. The way he held his knife, The way he moved around the kitchen as though he was in a trance, the way he didn't seem to notice her presence. It was as if the man she had once known was gone, replaced by something far more sinister. She couldn't take her eyes off the cutting board. There, in plain sight, was a piece of meat she did not recognize. It was pale, almost sickly looking, and it didn't resemble any cut of beef, chicken, or pork she had ever seen. Evelyn's heart skipped a beat as the realization hit her. This wasn't meat from any ordinary animal. She wanted to scream, to run out of the room, but her body was frozen. The thought of what she had just discovered felt like a weight pressing down on her chest, making it difficult to breathe. Jax didn't notice her panic. He didn't even seem to acknowledge that she was there anymore. He moved about the kitchen with a cold, almost practiced efficiency, as though he had done this countless times before. The steady rhythm of his actions, the chopping, the stirring, the plating, it all seemed like part of some sick routine he had perfected over the years. Evelyn's mind raced, her thoughts chaotic and desperate. She had to leave. She had to get away before it was too late. But she knew that running was not an option. Jax had already sensed that she was onto him. If she tried to leave now, there would be no escape. As Evelyn stood there, her body trembling with fear, Jax's movements became slower. He knew it was time. The silence between them was deafening, filled only by the clink of knives and the hiss of the pan. He had already decided what needed to be done. He would cook her the same way he had cooked countless others, the final ingredient in his twisted recipe. Evelyn's stomach churned, and her breath quickened as she realized the full extent of what Jax was about to do. She had walked into his trap. There was no escape. She was just another piece in his twisted plan, destined to be turned into a meal just like the others. Her fate had already been sealed. The moment of realization hit Evelyn with the force of a tidal wave. She stood frozen in place, unable to move or think clearly, as the horror of her situation settled in. The room felt smaller, the air heavier. It was as though time had slowed down, every second stretching out into eternity. She could still feel the sickening weight of what she had seen, the lifeless piece of human flesh on the cutting board, the strange, unsettling smell that had been filling the room for what felt like hours. Jax continued his work, methodically cutting and preparing the meal, completely oblivious to Evelyn's silent panic. He was no longer the man she had married. The man who had once held her in his arms and made promises of a future together was gone. In his place was someone monstrous, someone who had long ago shed his humanity. Evelyn's thoughts scrambled as she tried to think of a way out, but the truth was undeniable. She was trapped. The door to the kitchen was too far, the windows too high. There was no way to escape without him noticing. Her pulse quickened and her legs began to feel weak. The scent in the air felt suffocating, wrapping around her like an invisible chain, pulling her deeper into the nightmare. Her mind raced back to the day she had first started noticing the oddities in Jax's behavior. She had brushed off the small signs at first, the way he had started isolating himself, the late nights at the restaurant, the strange deliveries that came in the dead of night. She had convinced herself that she was overreacting, that there must be a rational explanation. But now she realized how wrong she had been. There was no rational explanation for what was happening here. The realization that she would never see the sunlight again, never feel the warmth of the outside world, made her chest tighten. Her life had been taken from her without her even knowing it, slowly and quietly, like a slow poison. She had been living in a house with a man who, for years, had been hiding a twisted secret from her. And now that secret was about to claim her life. As Jax continued his preparations, Evelyn's gaze flicked to the kitchen counter, where a large knife lay glinting in the dim light. She thought briefly of making a run for it, of using the knife to defend herself, but the reality of the situation quickly overwhelmed her. She knew that Jax was too strong, too prepared. Any attempt to fight back would be futile. The faint hum of the overhead light and the low sizzle from the pan were the only sounds that filled the air. They seemed to echo through the kitchen, mocking her as she stood frozen in terror. Her breath came in shallow gasps, and her body trembled with the weight of the realization that she would never leave this room alive. Evelyn's eyes darted around the kitchen, looking for something, anything, that could save her. But there was nothing. The walls seemed to close in, the space around her shrinking, until she could no longer escape the fact that she was in the final moments of her life. The truth was clear, there was no way out. Jax's movements never wavered. He moved with a strange calmness, as if preparing a meal for someone he loved. The horrifying contradiction of the situation. His cold, methodical actions paired with the brutal knowledge of what he was doing, struck Evelyn with an overwhelming sense of helplessness. There was no mercy here. There was no compassion. He had already made up his mind, and she was merely the next ingredient in his cruel recipe. The knife, which had once seemed so ordinary, now felt like an executioner's blade. It gleamed in the dim light, waiting for its next use. And Evelyn, standing motionless in the middle of the kitchen, knew that it would soon be turned on her. She had become just another victim in his dark, twisted world. As the final moments ticked by, Evelyn's thoughts turned to the life she had once known. She thought of her family, her friends, the small joys that she had taken for granted. But there was no time for those thoughts now. Her fate had already been sealed. The man she had loved, the man she had trusted, was about to take her life without a second thought. The finality of it all weighed heavily on her as the seconds stretched into an unbearable silence. Jack stepped closer, his expression impassive, and with that single chilling motion, he moved in for the final act. The house fell silent in the aftermath of the crime. The once lively, bustling kitchen now seemed eerily still, the air thick with the remnants of the gruesome act that had just unfolded. Jack stood motionless, his hands stained, his eyes glazed over with the detached calmness of a man who had carried out an unthinkable task. The weight of what had just happened hung heavily in the room, but to him, it was another step in maintaining the life he had built. A life that had been carefully constructed on lies, on deceit, on human flesh. Evelyn's body lay lifeless on the cold kitchen floor, her form now a mere object in the space where she had once been so full of life. The shock of her sudden demise seemed to hang in the air, thickening the atmosphere, yet Jax barely reacted. He had long since stopped seeing her as the woman he had married. She had become an obstacle, a threat to his carefully hidden secrets. And obstacles had to be removed no matter the cost. Jax moved with precision, almost mechanically, as he cleaned up the mess he had created. The blood that stained the floor, the remnants of Evelyn's life scattered across the kitchen. Everything was taken care of with the same meticulousness he had shown throughout his criminal enterprise. The knife was cleaned and placed back into its drawer, the cutting board wiped down as though nothing unusual had occurred. The kitchen was restored to its former state, the only clue to the crime a faint, unsettling smell that lingered in the air. But it would fade with time, just as the memory of what had happened here would begin to fade from the town. As Jax moved to the basement, his thoughts were cold and clinical. He had done what he had to do. Evelyn's body would be dealt with just like all the others before her. The process was familiar by now, disturbingly so. It wasn't his first victim and it wouldn't be his last. But it would be the one that would unravel the facade he had spent so many years constructing. The basement was where his most sinister activities had taken place. It was a place of preparation, a place where the final step in his grotesque cooking process happened. He had turned the space into something unrecognizable over the years, filling it with tools and equipment that were now synonymous with his twisted culinary artistry. He had perfected every detail, ensuring that no trace of his actions would remain. The body would be broken down, the evidence scattered, and his life would go on. But this time something was different. Evelyn was no ordinary victim. She had been a part of his life for years, and in some twisted way he had once cared for her. It was strange then to realize that he was moving on without hesitation, without guilt. There was no remorse, only the cold, detached satisfaction of having controlled the situation. The nagging feeling of his secret being threatened had been extinguished, and he could now return to his life with a clean slate. The process of dismemberment began as it always did. There were no hesitations, no second thoughts. The years of covering his tracks had taught him to be efficient. The body was broken down, the pieces prepared, and each part of Evelyn was turned into something unrecognizable, just as he had done before. It was a process that had become so familiar to him that it felt almost mechanical. Meanwhile, the town of Eldridge carried on as if nothing had changed. The evening passed quietly, with no one suspecting that the horrors of the night had just taken place just a few blocks away. The quiet streets were empty, and the lights in the windows flickered softly in the distance. It was a place that seemed far removed from the violence that had just taken place within the walls of Jax's home. But Jax knew that it would not stay quiet forever. As the hours passed, the weight of his crime seemed to grow heavier, but he refused to let it shake him. He had learned long ago to bury his emotions, to lock away the humanity that might have once been there. There was no room for guilt in his life now. There was only the next step, ensuring that Evelyn's disappearance would go unnoticed. Jax finished his work in the basement and moved upstairs, taking the time to clean the space. The house looked untouched, as if nothing had happened. He stood in the kitchen once again, surveying the scene. The house had returned to its normal, sterile state, and the smell of cooking meat had been replaced with a sense of eerie calm. In the coming days, Jax would go about his routine as usual, acting as if nothing had changed. He would continue to serve his tacos, maintain his restaurant and keep up the charade. No one would suspect a thing. But deep down he knew that the truth had begun to unravel. Evelyn's absence would raise questions sooner or later. And though he had gotten away with it for now, he knew that the silence of the night would not last forever. As the days passed, the disappearance of Evelyn Thompson did not go unnoticed. The people of Eldridge, though small and tight-knit, were quick to sense when something was wrong. Evelyn had been a constant presence in the town, known for her warm smile and friendly nature. Her sudden absence raised questions, especially given the lack of any explanation from her husband, Jax. But at first the community brushed off the idea of foul play. It was easy to believe that Evelyn had simply left, perhaps to visit family or maybe to get away for a while. Jax, after all, was the same affable man he had always been, a well-respected figure in town. But as the days turned into weeks, the unease began to grow. Evelyn's friends and family tried reaching out to her, but no one could get a clear answer. The phone calls went unanswered and the few messages left behind were never returned. Her sudden silence was uncharacteristic and the questions mounted. The people closest to Evelyn began to feel a gnawing sense of dread, but no one knew where to turn. The police, however, had a different perspective. Officer Diana Lawson, a seasoned investigator who had lived in Eldridge her entire life, had always been observant of the town's undercurrents. There were no significant crimes in Eldridge, and so the disappearance of a local resident, especially one as beloved as Evelyn, was out of the ordinary. Diana had noticed something in the way Jax had behaved during his interactions with her. He seemed distant, almost cold in his responses when she inquired about Evelyn's whereabouts. His calm, controlled demeanor felt out of place, too perfect for a man whose wife had disappeared without a trace. Diana began to dig deeper, starting with Evelyn's closest friends. The more she spoke to people who had known the couple, the more unsettling the picture became. Evelyn had been trying to reach out to a few people before her disappearance, mentioning vague concerns about Jax's behavior. First, the people around her had chalked it up to marital struggles, but as they reflected on her words, they realized there had been something more, something darker lurking beneath the surface. The image of Jax as a friendly, harmless chef began to crack. It didn't take long for Diana to learn that Evelyn had been investigating something. A few people remembered seeing her near the restaurant just days before her disappearance, looking nervous, even frightened. The pieces began to fall into place. Diana couldn't shake the feeling that Jax Thompson was hiding something. The police hadn't yet gathered enough concrete evidence to arrest him, but Diana knew there was no way Evelyn had left voluntarily. Something had happened to her and she was determined to find out what. The investigation turned toward Jax's restaurant, where the first real breakthrough came. During the investigation into his business, it was discovered that Jax had received large, unexplained shipments of meat and supplies in the middle of the night. His suppliers were hesitant to speak, but after some prodding, one of them revealed an unsettling detail. Jax had begun requesting unusual cuts of meat, ones that weren't typically found in the back of a taco joint. These were cuts of meat that would only be found in specialty butcher shops or, more disturbingly, human remains. The revelation rocked the small town of Eldridge. The thought of a chef, a man so trusted by his community, being involved in such gruesome acts was beyond comprehension. But the evidence, though circumstantial, was mounting. Diana's next step was to conduct a thorough search of Jax's home. She had no legal grounds to do so just yet, but as the investigation picked up steam, she was granted a warrant. When Diana and her team arrived at the Thompson household, they were struck by how normal everything seemed. The house was pristine, orderly, as though Jax had prepared it for an inspection. But the deeper they searched, the more unsettling details began to surface. In the basement, they discovered a small, hidden room, just as Evelyn had described to a few friends in passing. The room was filled with strange items. Jars of preserved organs, photographs of unknown people, and even pieces of clothing that didn't belong to Evelyn or anyone else they could identify. The most chilling discovery, however, came when the team found the tools Jax had used to carry out his crimes. Knives, cutting boards, and stains on the floor that didn't belong to any animal. The forensic team worked quickly to gather evidence. It was clear now that Jax Thompson had been running a far more sinister operation than anyone had ever imagined. His victims, their bodies turned into the tacos that had made his restaurant so infamous, were the key to understanding the true extent of his crimes. The team also discovered remains that were clearly human. The truth was undeniable now. Jax had been killing and cooking his victims, turning them into meals to be served to unsuspecting customers. The chilling realization that Evelyn had been his final victim. His wife, the one person who had discovered his horrific secret, added a layer of horror that no one in Eldridge had been prepared for. Jax, however, was nowhere to be found. As the investigation continued, a sense of dread lingered in the air. The community of Eldridge had been shattered by the truth. No one could believe that someone they had known and trusted for so long could be capable of such monstrous acts. And yet, the evidence was overwhelming. The search for Jax Thompson was now a race against time. With each passing hour, the fear grew that he might slip away, disappearing into the shadows as he had done for so long. The hunt for Jax Thompson grew more urgent with each passing day. As the investigation into his gruesome crimes progressed, it became clear that he had been carefully hiding his tracks for years. He had operated under the radar, blending into his quiet, unsuspecting community in Eldridge, all the while running a horrifyingly successful business that was built on human suffering. Now that the truth was out and the community was reeling from the shock, the police were racing against time to capture him. Jax had always been a master at evading attention. He had made a habit of moving in and out of the shadows, maintaining a life that seemed normal to everyone around him. His sudden disappearance wasn't out of character. In fact, it was exactly what the police had feared. They knew that once Jax realized the walls were closing in, he would vanish without a trace, just as he had done before when he had managed to cover up the other crimes he'd committed. Officer Diana Lawson, the lead investigator, became consumed with the search for Jax. Her thoughts constantly returned to the hidden room in the basement, the horrors they had discovered there. She couldn't shake the image of Evelyn's body, the final piece in a gruesome puzzle. Evelyn had been his wife, the one person who had been close enough to uncover the truth. Her murder was not only a senseless act of violence, it was a message. Diana knew that Jax would not stop. He had already killed to protect his secret, and if he was given the chance he would kill again. The police had followed every lead, scoured every corner of the town, but Jax was always one step ahead. They checked every abandoned building, every alleyway, even reaching out to nearby towns for help. Yet there was no sign of him. The longer he stayed hidden, the more desperate Diana became. The case was personal to her now. She had seen the devastation that Jax had caused in his wake, and she couldn't rest until he was caught. Then a breakthrough came. A report from a nearby town revealed a sighting of a man matching Jax's description. The town of Eldridge was small, and word of the search had spread quickly, so when Jax tried to pass through a nearby area under a false name, it didn't take long for local authorities to recognize him. The police set up a roadblock, hoping to catch him before he could escape into the larger cities where he might disappear for good. The tension mounted as Diana and her team closed in. Every minute felt like an eternity. The streets of Eldridge, which had once seemed peaceful and calm, now felt heavy with the anticipation of what was about to unfold. People began to gather in the streets, their eyes glued to the news, unsure of what would happen next but knowing that the nightmare that had haunted their town for so long was nearing its end. As the police surrounded the area where Jax was thought to be, Diana felt a knot in her stomach. The man they were chasing was not just a criminal, he was a man who had committed unspeakable acts and turned the lives of so many people into something unrecognizable. It was not just Evelyn's death that haunted her, it was the thought of all the other victims who had suffered in silence, never knowing the true horror that had been hiding in plain sight. The officers approached cautiously, knowing how dangerous Jax could be. His history of violence had been revealed in the darkest of ways, and there was no telling what he was willing to do to escape. As they moved closer to his last known location, a sense of inevitability hung in the air. The silence was deafening. And then they found him. Jax Thompson had been cornered. He was not the same man who had once been a well-respected chef. The facade had crumbled. Standing before the officers, his face was a mixture of cold defiance and fear. He knew his time had come. The life he had carefully constructed was over, and there was nowhere left for him to run. Jax was taken into custody without a struggle. As the handcuffs were placed on his wrists, the town of Eldridge seemed to exhale collectively, as though a dark cloud had finally been lifted. There was no more hiding, no more secrets. The horrors that had lurked behind the closed doors of his restaurant and his home were now exposed, and the justice that had eluded the victims for so long was finally within reach. In the days that followed, the investigation into Jax's crimes deepened. His arrest revealed a twisted history that no one in Eldridge had ever imagined. The scale of his actions was far worse than anyone had feared. Forensic evidence, witness testimony, and the grisly discoveries made in his basement revealed a pattern of brutality that had gone unnoticed for years. The people of Eldridge, still in shock, began to process what had happened. Jax, the man they had once trusted, had been a monster hidden in plain sight. Evelyn's death was not just a tragedy, it was the key that had unlocked the door to the truth. In the end, it was her bravery in discovering what she did that led to Jax's downfall. Her name became synonymous with the uncovering of the nightmare that had plagued the town for far too long. The arrest marked the beginning of the end for Jax Thompson. The town of Eldridge, forever scarred by the revelations of the past few weeks, began to rebuild. But the echoes of what had happened in the quiet corners of their town would never fade. The shadow of the cannibal chef who had once served human tacos would linger in their memories forever. Though Jax was behind bars, the scars he left on Eldridge would take a long time to fade. Evelyn's courage in the face of unimaginable horror would be remembered, and her death would serve as a painful yet important catalyst for the truth to come to light. Her story, tragically, was one of many, but it sparked a much-needed reckoning. In the end, justice was served, but the shadows of Jax Thompson's actions would forever hang over the town, a chilling reminder of what can happen when secrets are left to fester. If this story shocked you, made your heart race, or left you questioning the dark secrets hiding in plain sight, then I want you to do something important. Hit that subscribe button, but not just to stay updated. Hit it because the truth is out there and we're just getting started. The world is full of stories, real, chilling, and unsettling, waiting to be uncovered. So, if you want to dig deeper into the truth with me, leave a like, share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to ring that bell so you never miss the next chapter in this endless web of true crime.